I've been reading the Old Testament, and I've been focusing on Genesis, just that first chapter in the Bible. And every time I read it, I notice something else. And it's like this time as I was reading it, I had more of a bird's eye view, a wider angle lens of what is this all about? Why all these stories and these people and what does this mean? I see this repeated pattern of how God wants us to follow His will, but we keep not following His will. And it's a pattern that shows up over and over and over and over in the Old Testament of how this is manifested in these stories. So it's not just a story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Abraham and Sarah and so forth. The story has a purpose, and it's showing a human pattern of how God gives us a path and working in His will, and then we choose to exert our own will and go a different path, or to insert our opinion or our way of doing things. And so this pattern, it's repeated over and over and over in these stories, and that's telling us something. And for me, it made me realize that I think that's what the whole thing is about, is that we are to break that pattern. Even if we break that pattern in a moment, then we're moving in the right direction. But first we have to recognize that pattern, not just in ourselves, but historically and in these stories of the Bible. It's so clearly reflected that the story of humanity exerting their own will over God's will. And then the New Testament is a new pattern, because what does He do? He sends a perfect human who is human, but throughout, even to death, follows God's will. So the pattern is broken. And by that story, by that example, we're given an example, and we're given hope that, yes, indeed, this somehow will happen. We will be able to change this pattern of our constant breaking away from God and exerting our own will, instead of clearly being able to hear God's will and follow that path instead. So I'm going to give you just a few examples of these patterns, these stories of people, and how they chose their own path over God's path. I mean, it starts at the very beginning of the Bible. It's established. God made Adam and Eve, and then He gives a choice, and the choice is made to exert their own will by taking of the tree of knowledge. When Eve takes from the tree of knowledge, she's exerting will over what God's will was to leave that tree alone. So there's your first story. And from there on, it repeats over and over through generation, and it expands out. So it sort of almost spirals out of control. So you could think that that's a pretty depressing story about humanity. But we all know for ourselves how hard it is to break a habit. But we don't give up hope. We keep trying. And in the Bible, the end of the story is not the Old Testament, it's the New Testament of showing a new pattern. So we had Adam and Eve at the very beginning, and then we had Cain and Abel, where Cain kills Abel. So that certainly was not God's plan, and that certainly was a human will of their own ideas and own path. And then Abraham and Sarah. So what I thought was really interesting, I guess I could relate to that story, not in the fact of having the child, but in the fact of, I can see myself being impatient and deciding that, well, maybe I could make this happen quicker. Or maybe I can make this happen in my own way, and maybe that is God's will. So what happened with Abraham and Sarah is that God promised that they would have a child, and they were in advanced age, and so the idea of it is pretty preposterous. And really, though, they still had faith that they would have that child. But what ended up happening was that Sarah became impatient, and she wanted that child. So she manipulated things so that Abraham would bear a child with their maid, Hagar, and indeed did. So they had a child, but it wasn't in the way that God had lined out. It was in the way that, like, okay, God told us we're going to have a child, so now I'm going to make that happen. And it was a not so great way to go about it either. And I guess the parallel there, I think of, things in which maybe God destined me for or wanted me to do, and that's his will, but then I start to muscle my way through it, or I start to make decisions and formulate ideas on how that's going to happen, instead of just waiting. I've shared with you that I've been meeting with my Japanese friend once a month, and he's able to move somebody so lightly, with such a light touch. And I try to replicate that and practice it and try it with Canon. And some of them I have success and some I don't. And so the last meeting I had with Nato is his name, I said, I can't do this one. Why is that? And he said, well, you've got it. All you have to do is wait. Like, I don't have to do something. As soon as we're touching somebody or manipulating something, we feel like we have to do something. But instead, all I had to do was wait, and then it would happen. So I was erasing that gap of waiting. And maybe in that place of waiting, of stillness, of non-action, that's when God's will can come in, because we're not getting in the way. We're not directing it. So that's why I could kind of relate to the Abraham and Sarah story, is because they knew the story. They knew what was going to happen, but then they tried to make it happen in the way that they thought it was supposed to happen instead of the way that God had already planned it to happen. And all they had to do was wait. Oh, this is the other thing, is with all of these patterns of people falling off of their partnership with God and inserting their own will and their own way of doing it, God still kept the promise with them, and he still kept the faith to them. We often think about our faith to God, but God's faith to us, and that it's still, that opportunity is still there, no matter how much we mess up. God, that's a beautiful thing. So here we have Adam and Sarah. They go and do something pretty unscrupulous and try and get a child through the maid, and God's still there, and God still delivers his first, the original plan, and he gives Sarah and Abraham their own child at a later time, sort of almost teaching, well, if you just waited, this would have happened. But what's really interesting about the story is now we get all these family dynamics going on. The family drama. So, as we all hear, no family's perfect. There's always family drama. And I think this is one of the seeds, the root of it, is when this happened between Cain and Abel, Cain killing Abel, and then the Abraham and Sarah thing. It was like it took the bad stuff and it amplified it, because now there's more people involved. Now you got Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, and then their child Ishmael, and there was tremendous jealousy happening. Sarah was completely jealous of Hagar, even though she was the one that instigated the plan in the first place. And Ishmael was not treated well. The child of Hagar was not treated well by Sarah. at all. And so there was all of this oppressive, backstabbing, jealousy, all the things that we live with in drama nowadays was happening back then. And all because we didn't wait. You didn't wait for God's will and God's plan. We asserted our own plan. And then from there, it just keeps going downhill. So, I mean, the stories, if you go in there and just read the first few, like through 27 Genesis, you'll start to see this repeated pattern. And not only that, you'll see it exponentially growing because it's involving more people. And then the family dramas and all of these things happening. So I'm just going to read a short list and I'll put it up in the video. But these are stories of people asserting their own will. Okay? We have the Adam and Eve story. We have the Cain and Abel story. We have Abraham and Sarah story / Hagar, Ishmael. Hagar being the servant and Ishmael being the child that came out of that relationship. Then we have Rebecca and Jacob. Okay. They deceived Isaac and at his deathbed so that Esau would not get the birthright and Jacob would, where it was supposed to be the other way around. So then you have those two sons battling it out for years, Esau and Jacob. So Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham and Sarah, Rebecca and Jacob, Esau and Jacob, all being involved in doing their own plan or manipulating the plan that was originally laid out for them. And then I thought, well, certainly there's got to be some individuals that followed God's will. Let's see some examples of that. And so now, this list, those who trusted God's will and acted on it, was Abel. And we have Noah, the big story there. I mean, can you imagine God asking to build this ark and following that for, it took like 125 years to build this ark. Really something. And then we had Abraham. What an incredible story. Again, very powerful and sort of paralleling in a way the Jesus story. But God came to Abraham and said, take your own son up to the mountain and slaughter him as a sacrifice. And he did. He went up that mountain and then he tied up his son. And just as he was, I mean, you know, in his heart, he had to be sincere. Just as he was going to kill him, then God changed it. And I thought, I mean, that's kind of a cruel story on so many levels. But it's almost like it had to be an exaggerated circumstance for us to pay attention that here is somebody who followed God's will on probably the hardest thing you could ask anybody to do, to kill their own child. And the story is always kind of told from that angle. But when you think about it, Isaac, his child, also had to submit to the will of God and to his own father Abraham. He could have run away as soon as he figured out what was going on, but he didn't. I mean, I can't even imagine that either. And then there's the story of Joseph, and then Moses. So here's Moses, who was a poor speaker, a very insecure leader, and God came to him and said, you're going to be the ones that lead Israel out of Egypt. And, you know, here's Moses with a speech impediment and lack of security and like, I don't really want to do this, but he did. So what struck me is when I looked at these two different lists, you had the list above here with the people that are exerting their own will. And then you have this list over here of the individuals who followed God's will. And the first list was always in relationship with another person. So it was Adam and Eve, and it was Cain and Abel. It was Abraham and Sarah, Rebecca and Jacob, Esau and Jacob. So we're always in a relationship to someone else where this will was exerted either against that person, but always in that relationship. And last week or last session, we talked about the difference between relationship and fellowship. So these people were in relationship and they exerted their own will against God's will. But those who trusted God's will were single individuals: Abel, Noah, Abraham, Abraham's son, Isaac, Joseph, Moses. And it really struck me, not only from a literature structural standpoint, but also this had to be significant. And the significance, I think, there is that those who trust God's will, they were in relationship, they were in fellowship, they were in partnership with God. And they acted in a solo way, but with God. So they had singular resolve. And then that brought me to the thought of when Moses went up to the mountain and God spoke to Moses and told him he was going to be the leader, he's going to lead the people out of Israel. And Moses said, well, I'm not the candidate for that. And he said, well, you're going to do it. God said, you're still the one I want. And then Moses said, what do I call you? What do they call you? And God said, his name was I Am. That is so profound because it covers past, present, and future. I am. I am. That's what God said to Moses. Tell them to call me I Am. And then as I was reading in this Old Testament and recognizing these patterns, when God came to certain individuals to speak to them, like for instance, Abraham, Jacob, he would call their name. God called Abraham's name. And what is the response? I know I've talked about this before, but with another character in the Bible, I didn't realize that this happened so many times in the Old Testament with so many different individuals in the Bible. God calls on them, and what is their response? They say, "Here I am." Okay, well, that's pretty remarkable. Because as I've expressed before, they've got a life, they've got all this drama going on, they've already exerted their will, but God comes to them and their response is, here I am. But let's look at that closer. God's name, when he spoke it to Moses for the first time, said, I am. But when God calls on us, we change it to, here I am. And that one word of here separates us. When we say, here I am, that means there you are. And so from the very start of the Bible in Genesis, with our exerting our will through taking from the fruit of knowledge, but moving forward, every time God called on someone, they say, here I am. So we're now in this separate relationship. It's very significant, I think. God calls I am, and we call here I am. And I think maybe the overriding goal is that I am. I am with God. I am in God. God is in me. I am. So that we lose that here I am. And we're able to immerse ourselves more clearly and feel and be guided by God's will. And then we are this one individual, just like Abel, Noah, Abraham, all these single individuals that had trusted God's will so thoroughly, so completely. So then, pulling this into our Tai Chi journey, because I feel like our Tai Chi in many ways is showing a metaphor of the journey of life in the journey of Christianity and where we're headed with all of this. And so when we first learned Tai Chi, we're very labored. Where our mind is super involved. We're very physical, and we're using a lot of muscle, and we're using our mind in a very high level of intensity, our mind. But over time, as we begin to transform and we begin to rest in the movements, we don't have to think about those movements. They become more automatic. But we start to infiltrate our presence with the state of song, this relaxed, open state. And it's just layer at a time, layer at a time, layer at a time. For every ounce of tension that we release and every step towards being more relaxed and open, that is moving more towards God's will instead of our will. Because we know, we feel that when we're relaxed in an open state, that we have more energy running through us. That energy is flowing through us. And I think that's a whisper of God. I think that's the Holy Spirit. And we are so blessed because we actually get to feel this and experience this. That tingling, that warmth, that electrical flow through our body. And when we're in that place, even if just by a degree, or even if for 10 seconds, then it's just us, just like all those solo players that rested in God's will. Then it's just us and God flowing through us. So then, in that state, instead of us trying to move our body, He moves us, or the energy moves us, and we begin to follow it. And we're provided a place of stillness, of quietness, and in that place, we are in a place of listening. And we can hear more purely and hopefully understand and sense what God's will is instead of directing it ourselves. So that's the food for thought today on the patterns of the Bible, the patterns of humanity, and how we so often try to muscle our way through. But that there's that other option, and how the state of song, that relaxed open state, is maybe just a little doorway, a little portal to being able to hear God's will, sense God's will, and unify with God so that it's an I am instead of here I am. Let's do a little standing meditation and drawing a physical metaphor or a physical parallel of the engagement of our muscles as the engagement of our own will versus the release of the tension. And through that release, the creation of this soft, beautiful song, state of song. And that state is more joining, communing with God, and that more pure state where we can be in that state of I am instead of here I am. So let's just enter together in a silent stillness for just a minute or so.
I'll begin our prayer now. God, in this beautiful stillness, fill us with your presence. Open our ears so that we can hear you more purely. Soften ourselves so that we do not guide our own actions. Open our heart so that we feel your presence and that we are bound together in the state of I am. Thank you for your love and for that all you provide us, for our communion with you and for our communion with each other. Amen. Thank you.